My life is to vanquish evil.
Some say you're a holy man.
Has one name to fear. Van Helsing.
Monsters, mayhem, and a legendary hunter caught between light and darkness. Today we're diving deep into Van Helsing, the gothic action horror epic that brought together every creature from your nightmares. From hidden behind-the-scenes secrets to the film's ambitious tribute to Universal's classic monsters, we're breaking it all down. Welcome to J Cinema Film, where every frame tells a story. Let's hunt some monsters. Van Helsing is an action horror film written and directed by Stephen Sommers. It stars Hugh Jackman as monster hunter Van Helsing and Kate Beckinsale as Anna Valerius. The movie serves as an homage to Universal's classic monster films from the early 20th century, which were themselves inspired by the works of Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley, authors whom Sommers greatly admired. The title character was inspired by Abraham Van Helsing, the Dutch vampire hunter from Stoker's Dracula. Distributed by Universal Pictures, the film brings together iconic creatures such as Count Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, Mr. Hyde, werewolves, and others, echoing the multi-monster features Universal produced decades earlier. Although the film achieved strong box office returns, it received mixed reviews from critics. Plot: in Transylvania, Dr. Victor Frankenstein, assisted by Igor and Count Dracula, creates a living creature. When Frankenstein refuses to let Dracula use the monster for his own purposes, Dracula kills him, while Igor reveals his allegiance to the vampire. As villagers storm the castle, the monster escapes to a windmill with Frankenstein's body, and the mob burns the structure to the ground. Sometime later, Gabriel Van Helsing, a monster hunter working for the secretive Knights of the Holy Order, kills Dr. Jekyll after a battle with his alter ego, Mr. Hyde, at Notre Dame de Paris. Haunted by lost memories of his past and seeking redemption, Van Helsing hopes that his missions will one day restore his soul. At the Order's headquarters in Vatican City, Van Helsing is sent to Transylvania to destroy Dracula and protect Anna and Belknap Valerius, the last descendants of a noble family sworn to defeat the vampire or remain in purgatory forever. In Transylvania, Anna and Belknap attempt to slay a werewolf serving Dracula. The beast falls into a gorge with Belknap, biting him before dying. Van Helsing and his companion Carl, a clever friar and weapons expert, arrive in the village just as Dracula's three brides of Verona, Marischka, and Illyria attack. Van Helsing kills Marischka, earning the villagers' wary respect. That night, Valkana, now cursed as a werewolf, warns Anna before transforming and fleeing. Following his trail, Van Helsing and Anna discover Dracula's hidden laboratory, where he is trying to replicate Frankenstein's experiments to give life to his countless undead offspring. Dracula recognizes Van Helsing as an ancient foe. The vampire's offspring briefly come to life but quickly perish due to the missing element in Frankenstein's original formula. Van Helsing and Anna escape and encounter Frankenstein's monster, who reveals that he himself is the missing key to Dracula's experiment. Belknap overhears this revelation and reports back to Dracula. While escorting the monster toward Rome for safety, Van Helsing and his allies are ambushed near Budapest. Verona and Belknap are killed, but Van Helsing is bitten by the werewolf Belknap before he dies. Illyria captures Anna and offers to exchange her for the monster during a masquerade ball. Van Helsing hides the creature in a crypt, but Dracula's servants capture him nonetheless. Van Helsing and Carl rescue Anna, fleeing from the vampire-filled masquerade. At Anna's castle, Carl discovers that Dracula is actually the immortal son of Valerius the Elder. Cursed by a pact with the devil, Dracula can only be killed by a werewolf. Van Helsing, now struggling with his own growing curse, sends Anna and Carl to retrieve the antidote while he fights Dracula's forces. Lightning reanimates Dracula's monstrous offspring, and Van Helsing, transformed into a werewolf, battles Dracula in his demonic form. Frankenstein's monster helps Anna defeat Illyria, while Van Helsing kills Dracula, breaking the curse and destroying his children. Anna administers the cure to Van Helsing but dies in the process. Grieving, Van Helsing and Carl cremate her body on a cliff overlooking the sea. Frankenstein's monster departs to live in peace, and Van Helsing sees Anna's spirit reunited with her family before he and Carl ride away into the sunset. Cast and crew. The casting of Hugh Jackman as Gabriel Van Helsing marked a pivotal decision in bringing Stephen Sommers' vision to life for the 2004 action horror film. Sommers, fresh off the success of the Mummy franchise, sought an actor who could embody a rugged, charismatic monster hunter with a blend of physical prowess and emotional depth. Jackman, at the time, was riding high on his breakout role as Wolverine in the 2000 film X-Men, which had showcased his ability to handle intense action sequences while conveying inner turmoil. In interviews, Sommers recounted how he immediately saw Jackman as the ideal fit after watching X-Men, noting that the Australian actor's athleticism and screen presence echoed the swashbuckling heroes of classic adventure films like Indiana Jones, which influenced the tone of Van Helsing. Jackman himself expressed enthusiasm for the role in a 2004 press conference, explaining that he was drawn to the character's amnesia and moral ambiguity, allowing him to explore themes of redemption and forgotten sins. Preparation for the part involved rigorous training. Jackman underwent months of weapons handling, horseback riding, and stunt work in Prague, where much of the film was shot. He shared in a Screen Slam interview that the role required him to master a variety of gadgets, from crossbows to grappling hooks, drawing parallels to his Wolverine training but amplifying the Victorian-era flair. Behind-the-scenes footage from the making of documentary reveals Jackman's commitment, including performing many of his own stunts, such as the high-wire fights against Dracula's brides. This casting choice not only anchored the film but also boosted Jackman's status as a leading man in blockbuster action, paving the way for future roles in films like The Prestige and Real Steel. Kate Beckinsale's selection as Anna Valerius, the fierce Romanian princess and last descendant of a cursed family, brought a layer of elegance and intensity to the ensemble. Beckinsale, known for her work in period dramas like Much Ado About Nothing and action-oriented films such as Underworld, was chosen for her ability to portray strong, independent women in fantastical settings. In a joint interview with Jackman for blackfilm.com, Beckinsale discussed how Sommers approached her directly, emphasizing the character's blend of vulnerability and warrior spirit. She noted that Anna's arc from a vengeful hunter to a sacrificial hero appealed to her, especially as it subverted typical damsel in distress tropes. Preparation included extensive sword fighting and horseback training, with Beckinsale spending weeks in boot camp to match the physical demands. She recalled in the interview the challenges of filming in cold Transylvanian locations, where her elaborate corseted costumes added to the authenticity but restricted movement during fight scenes. Sommers praised her chemistry with Jackman, highlighting test screenings where their banter elevated the film's romantic subplot. Beckinsale's performance drew from her British heritage, infusing Anna with a regal poise that contrasted the chaotic monster battles. This role solidified her as an action star, leading to sequels in the Underworld series and appearances in films like Total Recall. Richard Roxburgh's portrayal of Count Dracula represented a deliberate reimagining of the iconic vampire, and his casting stemmed from Sommers' desire for a charismatic yet menacing antagonist. Roxburgh, an Australian actor with a theatre background and roles in films like Moulin Rouge, was selected after Sommers saw his ability to blend grandeur with subtlety. In an IGN interview from 2004, Roxburgh revealed his deep admiration for classic Dracula portrayals, citing influences from Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee, Klaus Kinski's Nosferatu, and Gary Oldman's version in Bram Stoker's Dracula. He aimed to infuse the character with a dark, sad, kind of Nightel de Macranville, Germanic type, opting for a physical transformation that included darker hair and a Romney King aesthetic to evoke a faded aristocrat with gypsy elements. This look, he explained, was far removed from his own appearance, requiring prosthetics and makeup sessions that lasted hours. Sommers noted in a CBR interview that Roxburgh's audition stood out for his commanding voice and ability to shift from seductive to feral, essential for scenes like the masquerade ball confrontation. Behind-the-scenes stories highlight Roxburgh's method approach. He isolated himself to study vampire lore, even incorporating subtle Eastern European accents. His chemistry with the brides, played by Lena Anaya, Josie Maran, and Sylvia Coloque, added a familial dynamic, with Roxburgh mentoring the actresses on set. This role showcased Roxburgh's versatility, later seen in films like Mission Impossible 2 and Sanctum, and remains one of his most memorable villainous turns. David Wenham's role as Friar Carl, the inventive sidekick providing comic relief and exposition, was a casting coup that balanced the film's darker tones. Wenham, fresh from his acclaimed performance as Faramir in The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, was chosen for his affable charm and ability to deliver witty dialogue amid chaos. In a YouTube interview for the film, Wenham described how Sommers contacted him after seeing his later work, envisioning Carl as a quirky inventor akin to Q from James Bond, which aligned with the film's inspirations. Wenham prepared by researching Victorian-era gadgets, collaborating with the props team to make Carl's inventions feel authentic. He shared anecdotes about improvising lines during shoots, such as the humorous explanations of Dracula's backstory, which Sommers encouraged to lighten the mood. Filming in Prague's historic sites added to the immersion, with Wenham recalling the cold nights spent triggering explosive devices for action sequences. His dynamic with Jackman was key. Test footage shows their banter evolving naturally, enhancing the buddy cop element. This casting decision highlighted Wenham's range, transitioning from epic fantasy to action horror, and influenced his later roles in 300 and Pirates of the Caribbean. Dead Men Tell No Tales. Shuler Hensley's embodiment of Frankenstein's monster brought a poignant humanity to the creature, and his casting drew from his extensive stage experience. Hensley, a Tony Award winner for his role in Oklahoma on Broadway, had previously played the monster in a musical workshop and concept album for Frankenstein by Mark Barron, making him a natural fit. In a 2004 interview clip, Hensley explained that Sommers sought an actor who could convey the monster's tragic isolation through physicality and voice, rather than relying solely on makeup. Hensley's preparation involved motion capture work for the character's lumbering gait, as well as providing reference for Mr. Hyde in the prequel animated film. He underwent grueling makeup sessions, with prosthetics that took 4 hours to apply, including bolts and scars that emphasize the monster's patchwork nature. Behind-the-scenes footage captures Hensley's interactions with Jackman and Beckinsale, where he improvised emotional beats, like the revelation of being the key to Dracula's plan. This role marked Hensley's film debut in a major blockbuster, showcasing his ability to blend pathos with spectacle, and led to further appearances in films like The Legend of Zorro. Will Kemp's casting as Vulcan Valerius, Anna's brother who transforms into a werewolf, introduced a dancer's grace to the feral role. Kemp, primarily known for his ballet career with companies like Matthew Bourne's, was performing in London when Sommers' team scouted him. In a Los Angeles Times article from 2004, Kemp recounted landing the part after an audition that highlighted his physical agility, essential for the werewolf transformation scenes. Sommers wanted Vulcan to start as a noble prince before descending into monstrosity, and Kemp's athletic background allowed for seamless stunt work, including wire flying and combat choreography. Preparation included studying wolf behaviors and working with CGI teams for the hybrid form. Kemp shared stories of filming the Gorge Fall sequence, where practical effects combined with digital enhancements captured the bite that seals his fate. His chemistry with Beckinsale added familial depth, with improvised sibling banter enriching their scenes. This breakout role transitioned Kemp from dance to acting, leading to parts in Step Up 2, The Streets and Rain. Kevin J. O'Connor's Igor, the treacherous assistant, was a reunion with director Sommers, having collaborated on The Mummy and Deep Rising. O'Connor's casting emphasized loyalty to familiar talent, as Sommers valued his quirky delivery for the hunchbacked servant. In a Facebook post compiling interviews, O'Connor discussed avoiding cliche copyright like Marty Feldman's Young Frankenstein imitation, instead opting for a sly, opportunistic portrayal. He drew from Bela Lugosi's original Igor in Son of Frankenstein, gloating in key moments as an homage. Preparation involved physical transformations, including a limp and disheveled appearance, with O'Connor spending time in makeup to perfect the look. On-set anecdotes reveal his improvisations during the castle scenes, adding humor to Igor's betrayal. This role reinforced O'Connor's niche as a character actor, seen later in G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra. The trio of Dracula's bride as Elena Anaya as Alira, Josie Maran as Mariska, and Sylvia Coloca as Renee were cast to embody seductive yet deadly vampires. Anaya, with her Spanish film background and Talk to Her, brought intensity to Alira's vengeful arc. Maran, a model-turned-actress, was selected for her ethereal beauty, fitting Mariska's early demise in the village battle. Coloca, an Italian-Australian newcomer, impressed in auditions with her regal poise for Verona. In a group IGN interview, they discussed wire work training for aerial fights, enduring harnesses for hours. Sommers directed them to channel classic horror sirens, with makeup enhancing their paled, fanged appearances. Their interactions with Roxburgh fostered a harem dynamic, with improvised hisses and laughs adding menace. Aileen Armstrong's Cardinal Jeanette, the Vatican overseer, provided authoritative gravities. Known from Braveheart, Armstrong was cast for his commanding presence in briefing scenes. He prepared by studying religious texts, infusing the role with moral weight. Robbie Coltrane voiced Mr. Hyde, drawing from his haggard persona but amplifying the brute force, with motion capture aiding the Paris brawl. Supporting roles like Stephen Fisher's Top Hat and Tom Fisher's Dr. Jekyll rounded out the ensemble, with Fisher's duo role requiring quick transformations. The casting process emphasized diversity, blending established stars with emerging talents to homage Universal's monster legacy while delivering modern spectacle. Expanding on Jackman's preparation, he trained with stunt coordinator R.A. Rundle, mastering a signature hat throw that became iconic. Interviews reveal his input on Van Helsing's costume, opting for a weather duster to evoke Western heroes. Beckinsale's stunt double, while used for extreme flips, couldn't replicate her precise swordplay, leading to her performing 80% of fights. Roxburgh's transformation included contact lenses for a piercing gaze, which he wore during rehearsals to stay in character. Wenham's Carl was initially scripted drier, but his ad-libs, like gadget malfunctions, were kept for laughs. Hensley's monster suit weighed 40 pounds, restricting movement but enhancing the lumbering effect and windmill scenes. Kemp's werewolf form used practical makeup for close-ups, with CGI for full transformations, requiring him to study animal documentaries. O'Connor's Igor included subtle nods to horror history, like a twisted grin echoing Lugosi. The Bride's casting involved chemistry reads with Roxburgh, ensuring their allure complemented his dominance. Inouye recalled the masquerade ball as challenging due to elaborate gowns restricting flight wires. Armstrong's scenes were shot in Rome's Vatican replicas, adding authenticity. Coltrane's voice work was recorded post-production, syncing with CGI Hyde's roars. Overall, the casting blended action readiness with character depth, creating a vibrant monster mash. Delving deeper into Jackman's role, his Australian accent was neutralized for a neutral European tone, practiced with dialect coaches. In behind-the-scenes clips, he discusses the Archangel reveal, drawing from biblical lore for the climax. Beckinsale's Anna drew inspiration from historical figures like Joan of Arc, blending feminism with fantasy. Roxburgh's Dracula included bat-form transformations, where he provided motion reference for CGI. He studied Romanian history for authenticity, incorporating gestures from gypsy folklore. Wenham's inventions were prototyped by ILM, with him testing props on set for realism. Hensley's emotional monologues, like the key revelation, were rehearsed in isolation to capture loneliness. Kemp's Prince to Wolf arc involved progressive makeup stages, symbolizing descent. O'Connor's betrayal scene was reshot for more menace, per Sommers notes. The Bride's backstories, though minimal, were fleshed out in rehearsals. Lyra as cunning, Mariska impulsive, Verona loyal. Their flight training in Prague's gyms built endurance for aerial battles. Additional cast like Klara Isova as a village woman added local flavor, with Czech actors filling background roles for authenticity. The Knights of the Holy Order extras underwent group training for Vatican scenes. Jackman's leadership on set influenced morale, organizing cast dinners to build bonds. Beckinsale's injury during a fight sequence delayed filming, but her resilience impressed the crew. Roxburgh's laugh was amplified in post for eeriness. Wenham's comic timing shone in the cure retrieval, improvising quips that survived edits. Hensley's suit included animatronics for facial expressions, synced to his performance. Kemp's final thanks to Van Helsing was ad-libbed, adding poignancy. O'Connor's homage extended to costume details, like a tattered lab coat echoing Frankenstein films. The Bride's makeup evolved from pale to vain during feeds, requiring daily touch-ups. This meticulous casting ensured each role contributed to the film's homage, blending spectacle with storytelling. Production development and pre-production. The genesis of Van Helsing represents Universal Pictures' ambitious attempt to reinvigorate their legendary monster franchise for a new generation of moviegoers. Following the tremendous commercial success of The Mummy in 1999 and its sequel The Mummy Returns in 2001, Universal executives recognized they had discovered a winning formula for reimagining classic horror properties as action-adventure spectacles. The studio's strategy was clear: transform their iconic monsters from figures of gothic horror into characters suitable for blockbuster entertainment that could compete with contemporary action franchises. Universal's decision to bring Stephen Sommers back into the fold was no accident. Sommers had proven his ability to balance reverence for classic monster mythology with modern sensibilities and cutting-edge visual effects. The director had demonstrated an innate understanding of how to make old-fashioned monsters feel fresh and exciting to audiences raised on digital effects and fast-paced action sequences. His success with the Mummy franchise made him the logical choice to helm what Universal hoped would become another lucrative series. The strategic parallels between Van Helsing and the Mummy extended even to the release date. Universal scheduled Van Helsing for May 7, 2004. Exactly 5 years to the date after The Mummy opened in theaters. This was no mere coincidence but a calculated marketing decision designed to capitalize on the anniversary and evoke memories of that film's success. The studio hoped that audiences who had embraced The Mummy would respond similarly to this new monster hunting adventure. However, while The Mummy drew heavily from the Indiana Jones template, blending archaeological adventure with supernatural thrills. Van Helsing took a different approach to its action influences. Sommers and his creative team looked to the James Bond franchise for inspiration, envisioning their monster hunter as a Victorian-era secret agent working for a clandestine organization. This decision shaped everything from the film's gadget-laden approach to action sequences to the sophisticated, globe-trotting nature of the protagonist's missions. Van Helsing would be presented as part detective, part warrior, and part spy, equipped with an array of specialized weapons and tools designed specifically for combating supernatural threats. The development process involved extensive research into Universal's monster movie heritage. Sommers was a genuine enthusiast of the classic Universal monster films from the 1930s and 1940s, and he wanted to pay proper homage to that legacy while creating something new. The challenge was finding a way to incorporate multiple iconic monsters into a single narrative without the film feeling overcrowded or losing focus. Universal had successfully created multi-monster movies in the 1940s with films like Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, House of Frankenstein, and House of Dracula, and Van Helsing aimed to recapture that spirit of monster mashups while leveraging modern filmmaking technology. The character of Gabriel Van Helsing was inspired by Abraham Van Helsing from Bram Stoker's Dracula novel, but Sommers and his team reimagined him significantly. Rather than the elderly professor of Stoker's creation, this Van Helsing would be a young, physically formidable action hero with a mysterious past. The decision to make the character an amnesiac with no memory of his life before being found near death on church steps added an element of intrigue and gave the character an emotional journey beyond simply hunting monsters. This backstory also allowed the filmmakers to hint at deeper mythological connections that could be explored if the film spawned sequels. The casting process was crucial to the film's development. Hugh Jackman was selected to bring Van Helsing to life. Riding high on his success as Wolverine in the X-Men franchise, Jackman brought the necessary physical presence and action credentials while also possessing the charisma and dramatic chops to make the character more than just a one-dimensional action hero. His casting signaled Universal's serious intentions for the property and helped attract other notable talent to the project. Kate Beckinsale was cast as Anna Valerius, the last descendant of an ancient Romanian family sworn to destroy Dracula. Beckinsale had recently completed work on the Underworld franchise, demonstrating her ability to handle action sequences while maintaining elegance and intensity. Her character provided both a romantic interest for Van Helsing and a strong female presence who could hold her own in battle against supernatural forces. The casting of Dracula proved particularly important, as the character needed to be both menacing and charismatic. Richard Roxburgh secured their role and approached it with enthusiasm and careful consideration. Roxburgh expressed his love for classic Universal monster films and cited influences ranging from Klaus Kinski's Nosferatu to Gary Oldman's interpretation of Dracula in Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 film. In interviews, Roxburgh explained his attraction to what he called the dark, sad, kind of Night de Macran v. Germanic type of monster movie, indicating his desire to bring depth to the iconic vampire. Roxburgh underwent a significant physical transformation for the role. He described the change as substantial, involving darker hair and a specific aesthetic vision. The actor wanted to evoke a sense of a Romani king or leader, a faded aristocrat, incorporating what he called that gypsy element. This vision resulted in a Dracula who looked nothing like Roxburgh's normal appearance, instead presenting as a figure who combined aristocratic bearing with an exotic, otherworldly quality that set him apart from previous screen incarnations of the character. David Wenham joined the cast as Carl, a friar and weapons inventor who serves as Van Helsing's sidekick and provides much of the film's comic relief. The character was designed to be the cue to Van Helsing's Bond, supplying specialized equipment and offering support during missions. Wenham's casting brought an affable energy to balance the darker, more intense elements of the story. Shuler Hansley took on the challenging role of Frankenstein's monster, a character that required both physical performance and emotional depth. The monster in Van Helsing is portrayed more sympathetically than in some interpretations, serving as a key to Dracula's plans rather than a simple villain. This interpretation harkened back to the Universal sequels where the monster became more of a tragic figure than an outright menace. The supporting cast included Kevin J. O'Connor as Igor, Will Kemp as Vulcan Valerius, and 3 actresses to portray Dracula's brides, Elena Anaya as Aelira, Sylvia Kaloka as Verona, and Josie Maran as Mariska. Each of these performers underwent extensive preparation for their roles, which would require both dramatic performance and demanding physical work against green screens and practical sets. Pre-production involved extensive design work to create the film's visual world. The production team needed to develop looks for multiple monsters that would feel both faithful to their classic Universal designs and suitable for modern visual effects work. This included reimagining werewolves, creating flying vampire brides, designing Mr. Hyde as a hulking brute for the opening sequence, and conceptualizing how Frankenstein's monster would appear and move. The weapons and gadgets that Van Helsing would employ required significant design work. The team created an array of specialized armaments, including automatic crossbows, grappling hooks, and various other tools that would seem plausible for the period while providing the functionality needed for contemporary action sequences. Each piece needed to look appropriately Victorian while being practical enough for the demanding stunts and action choreography planned for the film. Location scouting was another crucial element of pre-production. While the film is set in Transylvania and features scenes in Paris and Vatican City, the production would need to find locations that could represent these places while also accommodating the complex technical requirements of modern filmmaking. The Czech Republic emerged as the primary filming location, offering both tax incentives and a variety of locations that could double for the film's Eastern European settings. Filming of Van Helsing was an enormously complex undertaking that pushed the boundaries of what was technologically possible in 2004. Principal photography took place primarily in the Czech Republic, with extensive use of both practical sets and digital environments. The production team constructed elaborate sets that could accommodate both the performers and the extensive rigging required for the film's many action sequences and special effects shots. One of the production's most significant challenges was balancing practical and digital effects. While computer-generated imagery would play a major role in bringing the film's monsters to life, Sommers and his team recognized the importance of giving the actors something tangible to react to whenever possible. This meant creating practical effects, prosthetics, and animatronics for certain scenes while planning for digital replacements or enhancements in post-production. The opening sequence, set in a black and white Universal monster movie-style prologue, required special attention. This sequence needed to evoke the look and feel of classic 1930s horror films while establishing the film's mythology. The black and white photography and stylized production design created a deliberate homage to the original Universal monster movies, setting the stage for the colorful action extravaganza that would follow. Hugh Jackman's performance required extensive physical preparation and stamina. The actor performed many of his own stunts and endured long hours in harnesses for flying sequences, fight choreography against imaginary monsters that would be added digitally later, and scenes requiring complex wire work. Jackman's dedication to the physical demands of the role helped ground the fantastical action in believable human performance, even when he was fighting creatures that existed only as markers or reference points during filming. Kate Beckinsale similarly committed to the demanding physical requirements of her role. Anna Valerius needed to be a credible fighter and action hero in her own right, not simply a damsel in distress. Beckinsale trained extensively in weapons handling, stunt work, and fight choreography. Her scenes required the same level of physical intensity as Jackman's, and she performed many of her own stunts throughout the production. The Vampire Bride Act. The film's many action sequences required extensive effects work beyond just creature animation. Wire removal was necessary for nearly every stunt, as the safety wires and harnesses that protected performers needed to be digitally erased. Digital doubles sometimes replaced actors for dangerous or impossible stunts, requiring careful matching of both appearance and performance. Destruction effects, fire, explosions, and other practical elements often needed enhancement or complete digital replacement. Bob Duxey led the editorial process, working closely with Stephen Sommers to shape the film's final form. With hundreds of hours of footage and countless effects shots in various stages of completion, the editing process was enormously complex. The editors needed to maintain narrative clarity while incorporating extensive action sequences, ensure proper pacing across the film's substantial running time, and work with temporary effects that would eventually be replaced with finished shots. Test screenings played a role in shaping the final edit. Universal showed work-in-progress versions of the film to test audiences, gathering feedback that informed decisions about pacing, character development, and scene order. Some sequences were trimmed or restructured based on audience response, while others were expanded or clarified to improve comprehension. The sound design for Van Helsing was as elaborate as the visual effects. Creating distinctive and memorable sounds for each monster was crucial to their characterization. The werewolves needed aggressive, animalistic vocalizations that would be terrifying without becoming cartoonish. Dracula's various forms each required their own sonic signatures. The vampire brides needed sounds that would enhance their otherworldly, dangerous nature. The film's action sequences demanded intricate sound work. Every sword clash, gunshot, explosion, and impact needed appropriate sound effects that would enhance the visceral impact of the action. Environmental ambiances created a sonic world that extended beyond what was visible on screen, adding depth and atmosphere to each location. Foley artists created custom sounds for costumes, footsteps, props, and countless other details that contribute to the believability of the film's world. Dialogue editing and ADR, automated dialogue replacement, were necessary to ensure clear, properly mixed dialogue throughout the film. Some dialogue needed to be re-recorded in post-production due to on-set audio issues or performance adjustments, matching the acoustic properties of different environments and ensuring that ADR blended seamlessly with location-recorded dialogue required skill and attention to detail. The sound mixing process brought together all these elements of dialogue, sound effects, Foley, and musica into the final soundtrack. Mixers worked in specialized facilities, using sophisticated equipment to balance levels, create appropriate spatial placement of sounds, and ensure that the mix would work across different playback systems from theatrical sound systems to home televisions. Color correction and digital intermediate processing allowed the filmmakers to fine-tune the look of every shot in the film. This process involved adjusting color balance, contrast, brightness, and other image properties to create visual consistency across scenes and achieve the dark, gothic aesthetic Sommers wanted. Different scenes could be given distinct color palettes to enhance mood and support the narrative. The film's numerous effects shots required intensive quality control processes. Each shot passed through multiple review stages, with feedback from Sommers, the visual effects supervisors, and other key creative personnel guiding revisions. Some complex shots went through dozens of iterations before being approved for final inclusion in the film. Technical challenges emerged throughout post-production. The sheer volume of digital data generated by the visual effects works strained available computing resources. Render times for complex shots could stretch to days or even weeks, requiring careful resource management and prioritization. File management and version control were crucial to ensuring that the massive amount of digital assets remain organized and accessible. The release schedule created pressure throughout post-production. Universal wanted the film ready for its May 2004 release date, giving the post-production team a finite amount of time to complete thousands of complex shots. This led to intense work periods, particularly as the deadline approached, with teams working around the clock to finish effects shots and complete the final mix. Despite the challenges, the post-production team successfully completed the film on schedule. The finished product represented hundreds of thousands of hours of labor by talented artists and technicians who brought Sommers' vision to life. While time constraints meant some shots might not have received as much refinement as ideal circumstances would have allowed, the overall achievement was substantial, creating a visual spectacle that showcased the capabilities of early 2000s digital filmmaking. Music. The musical score for Van Helsing was composed by Alan Silvestri, a veteran composer known for his work on films ranging from Back to the Future to Forrest Gump to The Mummy Returns. Silvestri's involvement brought both prestige and expertise to the project, as he was well regarded for his ability to craft memorable themes and support action sequences with driving, energetic music. Silvestri approached the Van Helsing score with an understanding of the film's homage to classic Universal monster movies while also recognizing its contemporary action-adventure sensibility. His musical approach needed to serve both masters, evoking the romantic gothic atmosphere of vintage horror while providing the propulsive energy required by modern blockbuster action sequences. The composer created distinctive themes for the major characters and concepts in the film. Van Helsing received a heroic, memorable theme that would recur throughout the score, establishing his character musically and providing a sonic anchor for audiences. This theme needed to convey both the character's heroism and the underlying darkness and mystery surrounding his forgotten past. Dracula's musical identity was appropriately menacing and grand, befitting the film's primary antagonist. Silvestri crafted music that emphasized the vampire's aristocratic bearing and ancient evil, using orchestral colors and harmonic language that evoked both elegance and threat. The music for Dracula needed to make him feel powerful and dangerous without becoming a caricature. Anna Valerius received musical characterization that emphasized both her strength as a warrior and the tragedy of her family's curse. Her theme needed to support both her action sequences and the more emotionally vulnerable moments where her character's burden becomes apparent. The romance between Anna and Van Helsing also required musical support, with Silvestri crafting material that could underscore their developing relationship. The vampire brides received appropriately seductive yet sinister musical treatment. Their scenes required music that would enhance their supernatural allure while also emphasizing the danger they represented. Silvestri used vocal elements and unusual instrumental combinations to create an otherworldly quality for these characters. Frankenstein's monster presented unique musical challenges. The character is portrayed sympathetically in the film, neither villain nor hero but rather a tragic figure caught up in Dracula's schemes. Silvestri's music for the monster needed to convey pathos and humanity even while acknowledging his monstrous appearance and the fear he inspired in other characters. The werewolf transformations and battles required savage, primal music that would enhance the visceral horror of these sequences. Silvestri used aggressive orchestral techniques, including harsh brass, pounding percussion, and dissonant harmonies to create music that matched the ferocity of the werewolves. Action sequences throughout the film demanded carefully crafted music that would support and enhance the on-screen excitement. Silvestri excelled at action scoring, and Van Helsing gave him numerous opportunities to demonstrate this skill. From the opening encounter with Mr. Hyde to the climactic battle between Van Helsing and Dracula, each sequence received music that heightened tension, supported the rhythm of the editing, and added emotional resonance to the physical action. The score also needed to support quieter, more intimate moments between characters. Conversations, character revelations, and emotional beats required musical underscore that would enhance without overwhelming the performances. Silvestri demonstrated his versatility in these scenes, providing subtle support that allowed the drama to breathe while maintaining the gothic atmosphere. The composer made use of a full symphony orchestra to record the score, giving the music a rich, powerful sound appropriate to the film's scope and ambition. Orchestra sessions took place over multiple days, with Silvestri conducting musicians through the complex score. The orchestral approach gave the music a classical, timeless quality that connected it to the tradition of Universal monster movies while the contemporary recording techniques ensured the sound quality met modern standards. Choir and vocal elements added an additional layer to certain sequences. Choral music brought the sense of the sacred and mythical to scenes involving the Knights of the Holy Order and provided dramatic enhancement for key emotional moments. Solo vocal performances contributed to the otherworldly atmosphere, particularly in sequences involving the vampire brides. Electronic elements were sparingly used to supplement the orchestra, primarily for special atmospheric effects or to enhance particularly intense action moments. Silvestri generally favored the warmth and organic quality of acoustic instruments, but strategic use of electronics added contemporary edge where appropriate. The music needed to be carefully integrated with the sound design during the mixing process. In action sequences particularly, music and sound effects compete for the audience's attention. requiring careful balance to ensure both elements could be heard and appreciated. The mixing team worked to create space in the sonic spectrum for both music and effects, using EQ and spatial positioning to prevent muddle. Silvestri's completed score was released as a soundtrack album, allowing fans to experience the music independently from the film. The album presentation of the score sometimes differed from the film version, as cues were edited together or presented in different order to create a more satisfying musical experience outside the context of the film. The composer's work on Van Helsing demonstrated his ability to serve multiple functions simultaneously, creating memorable themes, supporting narrative and character, enhancing action and drama, and maintaining stylistic consistency across a long, complex film. While the film itself received mixed reviews, Silvestri's score was generally praised as a strong element that contributed significantly to the viewing experience. Released theatrical, Van Helsing received a wide theatrical release that reflected Universal Pictures' confidence in the property and their hopes that it would become a major commercial success. The studio's marketing campaign began months before the film's premiere, building awareness and anticipation for what they positioned as the summer's must-see action spectacle. The May 7, 2004 release date was strategically chosen for multiple reasons. Coming early in the summer season allowed Van Helsing to establish itself before other major blockbusters arrived. The date's connection to The Mummy's release 5 years earlier was part of the marketing strategy, encouraging comparisons to that successful film. Universal hoped that positioning Van Helsing as the spiritual successor to The Mummy would translate fan enthusiasm from the earlier franchise to this new property. The marketing campaign for Van Helsing was extensive and multifaceted, utilizing traditional advertising channels alongside emerging digital platforms. Television advertising began several weeks before release, with commercials highlighting the film's action sequences, visual effects, and star power. Hugh Jackman's popularity following the X-Men films made him a strong marketing asset, and promotional materials prominently featured the actor in Van Helsing's distinctive costume. Print advertising appeared in entertainment magazines, newspapers, and on billboards in major cities. The theatrical poster design went through multiple iterations, with the final version featuring Jackman in the foreground with Kate Beckinsale and various monsters arrayed behind him. The imagery emphasized both the action-adventure elements and the monster movie heritage, attempting to appeal to broad audiences while also signaling to horror fans that this would be a monster-packed experience. Online marketing was increasingly important by 2004. And Universal created an extensive web presence for Van Helsing. The official website featured trailers, behind-the-scenes content, character information, and interactive elements designed to engage fans. Online banner advertising appeared on popular entertainment and genre websites, directing traffic to the main site and building awareness. Trailer releases were carefully orchestrated to build momentum. The first teaser trailer appeared months before release, offering glimpses of the film's monsters and action without revealing too much of the plot. Subsequent full-length trailers provided more story context while showcasing impressive visual effects work. These trailers were distributed theatrically before other major releases and were made available online, where they could be downloaded and shared by fans. Promotional partnerships expanded the film's reach beyond traditional advertising. Tie-in products included action figures and toys from various manufacturers, appealing to collectors and younger audiences. Video game adaptations for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and Game Boy Advance extended the Van Helsing experience beyond the film, featuring Hugh Jackman reprising his role for the PS2 and Xbox versions. These games were released simultaneously with the film, providing additional revenue streams and marketing support. The film's premiere was a major event, with Stephen Sommers, Hugh Jackman, Kate Beckinsale, and other cast members attending red carpet festivities. Media coverage of the premiere provided additional publicity, with entertainment news programs and magazines featuring interviews and behind-the-scenes glimpses. The stars embarked on a promotional tour that included appearances on talk shows, interviews with entertainment journalists, and attendance at special screenings in major markets. Universal arranged special preview screenings for critics and influential audiences in the weeks before the wide release. These screenings aimed to generate positive word of mouth and early reviews that could be used in subsequent advertising. However, the critical response from these early screenings was mixed to negative, which would impact the film's reception and long-term performance. The theatrical release strategy involved opening the film on thousands of screens simultaneously, maximizing the film's initial impact and box office potential. This wide release approach was standard for major studio blockbusters and reflected Universal's confidence in the film's commercial appeal. The studio secured prime booking in major theater chains, ensuring that Van Helsing would be readily available to audiences across the country. International release was coordinated to follow shortly after the domestic opening, with Van Helsing arriving in major foreign markets within weeks of its U.S. debut. The international marketing campaign was adapted to local markets, with promotional materials and advertising tailored to regional preferences and media consumption habits. Hugh Jackman's international appeal, particularly strong in Australia and the United Kingdom, was leveraged in those markets. The film's theatrical presentation was designed to maximize its visual impact. Universal encouraged exhibition in theaters with the best sound systems and largest screens, positioning Van Helsing as an experience that demanded to be seen in optimal conditions. Some theaters offered special presentations on premium showings that charged higher ticket prices but provided enhanced viewing conditions. Opening weekend was crucial to the film's commercial fortunes. Universal's marketing push intensified in the final week before release, with television advertising reaching saturation levels and publicity appearances by the cast generating maximum media coverage. The studio hoped for a strong opening that would establish Van Helsing as the early summer's dominant film and generate positive word of mouth that would sustain its box office performance. The film opened at number 1 at the domestic box office, earning $51 million during its opening weekend of May 7 to 9, 2004. This was a solid debut that met Universal's expectations, though some analysts had predicted an even larger opening given the film's budget and marketing spend. The opening weekend performance was encouraging but not overwhelming, suggesting that while the film had attracted significant initial interest, it faced challenges in becoming a breakout hit. Subsequent weekends saw typical declines as Van Helsing faced competition from other summer releases. The film's box office trajectory followed common patterns for action blockbusters, with substantial drops in the second and third weekends as audiences who were most interested in seeing the film had already attended and new releases drew potential viewers elsewhere. The theatrical run of Van Helsing extended for several months, though its presence in theaters diminished as time passed. The film eventually left most first-run theaters and moved to discount second-run venues before concluding its theatrical exhibition. The final domestic box office total of $120,177,084 was respectable but somewhat disappointing given the film's substantial budget and Universal's franchise ambitions. Home media. The home media release of Van Helsing represented an important secondary revenue stream for Universal and an opportunity to reach audiences who had not seen the film theatrically. The studio planned an extensive home video campaign that would maximize the film's value in this increasingly important market. The DVD release was scheduled for late 2004, several months after the film concluded its theatrical run. This timing followed industry standards, allowing for adequate theatrical exhibition before making the film available for home viewing. Universal prepared multiple DVD editions to appeal to different consumer segments and maximize revenue opportunities. The standard DVD edition offered the film in widescreen and full-screen formats to accommodate different consumer preferences and television types. Special features included a commentary track by director Stephen Sommers and key members of the production team, providing insights into the making of the film. Deleted scenes, though minimal, were included to show viewers footage that didn't make the final theatrical cut. A 2-disc collector's edition DVD provided extensive bonus features for dedicated fans and home video enthusiasts. This edition included multiple featurettes exploring different aspects of the production, from creature design and visual effects to costume design and location filming. Behind-the-scenes footage gave viewers glimpses into the complex production process, showing how actors performed against green screens and how practical and digital effects were combined. Interactive features took advantage of DVD technology to provide engaging supplementary content. These included galleries of production art, costume designs, and storyboards, allowing viewers to explore the creative development of the film. Easter eggs and hidden features accessible through navigation of menus provided additional content for viewers willing to explore the disc thoroughly. The DVD release was supported by its own marketing campaign, though less extensive than the theatrical reviews. In fact, number 1 Van Helsing is a big-budget B-movie that pits an Indiana Jones-style figure against Dracula, werewolves, Frankenstein's monster, and even Mr. Hyde. The action starts immediately as Frankenstein gives life to his monster, with Count Dracula observing the experiment. Decades later, a secretive council run by the Catholic Church dispatches the race monster hunter Van Helsing to the scene to finally kill Dracula. Dracula and the other vampires have been terrorizing the region all along. This sets off a series of intense action sequences, each one bigger than the last, and they're all full of great special effects. Van Helsing has little foul language but lots of fighting between the hero and the monsters. Van Helsing uses guns, arrows and a small buzzsaw. Although there are several positive mentions of God and Christianity, other parts of the movie's theology are unbiblical, as the hero controls the salvation of an entire family, and there is talk of past lives. There is also a priest who says something bitter and ungodly in a confessional. In addition, the movie is far too campy for today's audiences. Despite the exciting graphics, it will be quickly forgotten. Content: C. FRFR. ABB. LVV. SAD. M. Light Christian worldview with hero who is called by the church and crosses himself in the Roman Catholic manner, a monster that reads the Bible, and several statements such as God will forgive us, with stronger false religious elements that include unbiblical theology, such as leaders from many different religions, including a Tibetan monk, work together in a conspiracy in talk of past lives, and anti-biblical content includes vampire incinerating a crucifix, a friar violates his vow of chastity, and an annoyed priest tells the hero during confession that he deserves a week in hell for breaking a window. 3 light obscenities and 6 utterances of oh my god suspenseful action violence. Vampire impales self and bites man. A stampede of villagers breaks down castle door. Corpse's skin peels off and grows back. Werewolf chases people and is shot. Werewolf kills men. Man shoots monster and severs its arm. Monster falls to death. Evil vampires turn into bats and are shot with arrows. Vampires drink blood. Vampires staked. Monsters and vampires killed and decay instantly. And lots of explosions. Brief sexual innuendo and fornication implied. Hero drinks absinthe. Evil monster smokes cigar and vampire mentions grave robbing and hero willfully disobeys instruction of the church. Genre: horror, fantasy. More detail: Van Helsing is a big-budget B-movie that pits an Indiana Jones-style figure against Dracula, werewolves, Frankenstein's monster, and even Mr. Hyde. Story takes a backseat to action sequences and spectacular special effects, as each fight scene attempts to outdo the last one. Even a glimpse at the stars resumes tells you that this is an action-only movie. Hugh Jackman is Wolverine in the X-Men movies, and Kate Beckinsale was in last year's similar Underworld. The action starts immediately as Dr. Frankenstein gives life to his monster, with Count Dracula sponsoring the experiment. Fearful villagers storm Frankenstein's castle and burn it to the ground. Decades later, a secretive council run by the Roman Catholic Church dispatches the race monster hunter Van Helsing to the scene to finally kill Dracula, who has been terrorizing the region in the intervening years. Through a bizarre intricacy of the plot, if Van Helsing does not kill Dracula very soon, several generations of one family will be doomed forever and not allowed into heaven. Van Helsing borrows some imagery and ideas from Christianity and Catholicism to make its hobbled plot spin, as Van Helsing believes that his talent to slay monsters is a gift and mission from God, and he crosses himself whenever he comes across a dead person. Salvation is even the plot's motor, although it is gained at the hands of the monster hunter and not God alone. Several other characters refer to God, asking for his help or forgiveness, but the talk seems a formality. A friar meets a barmaid and fornicates with her almost immediately, while an annoyed priest tells Van Helsing, during confession, that he deserves a week in hell for breaking a window. The priest's irreverent, flagrantly unbiblical statement is proof that this movie uses religion simply as an intriguing backdrop for its vacant story. Very similar to Hellboy, there are references to Christianity, but no deep understanding of it as a thriving, real way of life. Aside from the theological problems, the movie is a hodgepodge of elements that never come together. There are scary monsters to suggest a horror movie, explosions and fight scenes that say action movie, eye-roll-inducing comic relief, a vaguely mystical plotline, and even a perfunctory love story. Rather than complement each other, the components clutter the movie and bore the audience. The filmmakers should have been more straightforward and admitted that they just wanted a showcase for their special effects. Those effects, however, are excellent. The dark, twilight atmosphere lends them a visual realness not found in some other CGI-laden movies. In the end, though, Van Helsing is too campy to enjoy very much. The collection of 1930s movie monsters comes off as silly, and I haven't even mentioned Dracula's wives, with their terrible Transylvanian accents and cartoonish cackles. If only someone could make a movie that used the sophisticated special effects to enhance the story, not substitute for it. Number 2. Following the massive success that was The Mummy, which spawned an entire franchise, director Stephen Sommers teamed up with Universal again to do a quasi-remake crossover of several more of their classic monsters of the 1930s/1940s. The result was 2004's Van Helsing, a movie that featured Count Dracula, several wolf men, Frankenstein's monster, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and of course the titular monster hunter Van Helsing. Upon release, reviews were mixed at best. It performed decently at the box office, nearly doubling its budget, but it never quite took hold like The Mummy did and is remembered far less fondly. So in honor of its 20th anniversary, which is also the 25th anniversary of The Mummy since they released on the same day 5 years apart, we wanted to take a look back at Van Helsing and see if among all the cheese and camp, there was something of value. Ultimate crossover. Nearly a century before the MCU, the Universal monsters were crossing over with each other. And 4 years before Iron Man, Van Helsing was honoring that tradition. Starring Hugh Jackman, in between the second and third X-Men movies, we see Van Helsing on a 19th-century Bond-esque mission to Transylvania, complete with his gadget nerd friar played by David Wenham. As far as crossovers go, the movie does a decent job plot-wise of bringing 3 iconic movie characters together. Dracula has been trying for years to resurrect his children because they're born dead, since their parents are undead, and Dr. Frankenstein's monster is the key to life. Meanwhile, he uses werewolves as henchmen, and Van Helsing is there to kill Dracula since he was the original vampire. Not too simple, not too complicated. The plot works for what it needs to do and brings these characters together in a way that's interesting and fun. It also made some interesting changes to the lore, such as Dracula turning not into a small bat, but a giant bat that honestly looks more like a dragon. Couple that with some amazing production design that's very much inspired by old Universal, and you'd think you were taken back in time to that era, especially with the stellar opening scene. That is until you see the CGI, which is simultaneously this movie's greatest blessing and curse. Aside from the dialogue, solid visuals, at the time, upon release, one area that many reviewers praised was the film's visuals. Many were very harsh on things like character, story, and dialogue, but they all mentioned the impressive visual effects. These included a new type of werewolf transformation that involved the skin ripping off to reveal the fur underneath, an obvious metaphor, as well as the aforementioned Dracula turning into a giant bat dragon. The CGI wasn't on the level of something like Lord of the Rings, which had just wrapped up a few months earlier, but at the time, they looked pretty interesting and fun. In the 20 years since, however, it hasn't aged the best. And while many argue that CGI peaked in 2006 with the motion capture on Davy Jones in Pirates of the Caribbean, the CGI in Van Helsing was nowhere near that level, even 2 years before. A lot of it looks very cartoonish by today's standards, and the only reason why some of the CGI looks like it could have been made today is the sad fact that studios rush VFX companies and the product is far from their best work. So in a strange way, the main thing that it was praised for doesn't hold up anymore, but the thing it was criticized for has actually helped it gain a cult following. Too campy for its own good. To be fair, no one ever said that Van Helsing was a movie that took itself seriously. It's filled with quippy one-liners like "It's a Joss Whedon wannabe," but definitely do. Novel The Stand remains his longest, if you go by the extended version, otherwise it's second to it, and King always referred to it as his Lord of the Rings. Thus, it was inevitable that an adaptation would be made, and given the book's immense amount of characters and plot, a 4-part TV miniseries seemed the best way to do so. Directed by Mick Garris, and airing on ABC over 4 nights in May 1994, The Stand disproved the sentiment that the novel was unfilmable due to its massive scope and scale. So in honor of its 30th anniversary, we wanted to take a look back at The Stand 1994 miniseries, and examine what it did right, what it could have done better, and understand why it will always be more memorable than the 2020 CBS adaptation you forgot even existed. A Broken Bar. Epic story. Divided into 4 90-minute episodes, each part of this miniseries feels like its own movie, especially that first part. Right from the beginning, director Mick Garris treats the audience to a grim but groovy montage as we see a myriad of dead bodies, victims of the deadly Captain Trips virus, while Don't Fear the Reaper plays and the opening credits casually present themselves. Not only does the first part serve as a solid standalone plague apocalypse movie, but it really takes its time and lays the groundwork for the characters and sets up things that will pay off later, much like King's book did. Even with all this, it still struggled to adapt everything, which is why, especially in the later episodes, things started to feel rushed. However, aside from a 10-episode TV season, which they tried in 2020 but screwed it up in other ways, this was the best method to adapt King's novel, and Mick Garris and CO did a damn good job of doing so, especially with the limited TV movie budget they had. Epic ensemble. But of course, the best thing about 1994's The Stand is its outstanding ensemble cast. You've got the likes of Gary Sinise, Molly Ringwald, Ossie Davis, Ruby Dee, Miguel Ferrer, Adam Stork, Karen Nemec, and even Rob Lowe, all in main roles. But even the supporting roles are filled with talented actors like Bill Fagerback, Shawnee Smith, Ken Jenkins, and even Kathy Bates, Ed Harris, Jeff Goldblum, Joe Bob Briggs, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar pop up in cameos in the first episode. Granted, some of the characters come off as cartoonish at times, but by the end, they all feel like fully fleshed out real people that the miniseries takes its time letting us get to know. As you watch it, you wonder what you might do in this post-apocalypse and which side you might end up on. And frankly, it's a seemingly side character, Henry Reed, who winds up having the best arc of anyone, so much so that King has admitted that's his favorite character from the story. Epically held back, but of course, we have to talk about those effects and that ending. To be fair to the movie, it did the absolute best that it could with early 90s effects, especially on a TV budget. Sure, films like Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park were doing wonders with early CGI, but they also had a lot more money to play with than The Stand ever did. But honestly, the effects aren't even the issue with the ending. The ending itself is the issue. Part of the reason why Stephen King books have been notoriously difficult to adapt is because so many of these stories involve complex, supernatural things that are easy to explain in writing but very hard to show visually without them looking cheesy. Thus, when the hand of God intervenes in the novel, It works because you're just reading it on a page. It's also a literal deus ex machina, but for a book that's been about the nature of good versus evil and that features a villain who's a very obvious devil metaphor, it works. But the second you try to show a giant hand coming from the sky, especially with early 90s TV effects, it just looks silly. When people said the book was unfilmable, it was scenes like that they were referring to. But Mick Garris and his outstanding cast and crew proved that for about 90% of the book, it very much was adaptable and adapted. They did. Sure, the 2020 version had better effects, and way more runtime, but it just felt shallow, like it was counting on its audience already having seen this version. And when a remake has to resort to that, it's just evidence of how big a shadow the predecessor cast a broken bar. What do you think of The Stand? Do you think the ending works? Have you ever read the book? Let us know in the comments. For more reviews, news, rankings, and other fun horror/sci-fi/fantasy content, follow Halloween Year-Round on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. You can also shop Halloween Year-Round merchandise on Redbubble and support us on Patreon. Number 3. Ebert got it. In his 3-star review of the mostly reviled 2004 Stephen Sommers film, Van Helsing, the late critic wrote, "At the outset, we may fear Sommers is simply going for X overkill, but by the end, he has somehow succeeded in assembling all his monsters and plot threads into a high-voltage climax." While mostly everyone else trashed the Mummy director's ludicrously ambitious attempt at lassoing not 2 but 4 movie monster franchises together in one fell swoop, Ebert insisted, Van Helsing is silly and spectacular, and fun. And he's right. Damn it, the movie was just about 10 years too early. I had the pleasure of revisiting Van Helsing in early February as part of my podcast's exploration of winter horror movies, and, sure, the former childhood obsession of mine does not by any means measure up to other chiller classics like The Shining or Let the Right One In. But Sommers' vision for an action-adventure monster mash feels just as exciting and distinctive now as it did almost 2 decades ago, when I was but a frumpy little boy, confused and aroused by leathery corsets, hairless werewolf chests, and Dracula's 3 terrifyingly randy wives. Like Frankenstein's monster, I guess, I had become alive. Before we go further, Van Helsing is not a great movie, perhaps not even a good one, but by God is it a thrill to experience, especially in 2022. When the biggest movie franchises in the world are sexless, sanitary, and so uninterested in visual originality that they tend to resemble those car commercials that take place in gigantic airplane hangars. Like the more successful but altogether equally batshit Mummy movies, Van Helsing is belligerent, as well as completely free from all the confining fence posts of reality and thematic consistency that for some reason seem required today to sustain a multi-movie franchise, and it's better for it. Sommers isn't concerned with rules. Note when it comes to the movie's overtly Christian, demon-laden world, which somehow takes place during both the Industrial Revolution and, from the looks of some sequences, in the 18th century. The narrative, if you can find one between the glorious bedlam of flaming set pieces and screaming, makes so little sense that if you try to decipher it, you're left with whatever the pleasurable equivalent of a concussion is. For a movie like this, though, we're not looking for plot, we're looking for marvelous chaos. In Van Helsing, chaos reigns. Dracula, you see, has been defiling maidens all around Romania for centuries, amassing a gigantic nest of vampire eggs that resemble throbbing scrotums. Since his hellspawn are undead, they require a certain form of electricity to be brought to life. Count Vlad, portrayed here by a horny and howling Richard Roxburgh, has been employing werewolves for this cause to no avail. He needs a better battery, something that, like his fetal bat children, was previously dead. That's where Frankenstein's monster comes in. It's revealed in the opening minutes that the Chris Angel-looking Dracula was funding the monster's creation all along. Have you disassociated yet? Van Helsing, here named Gabriel and not the totally unsexy Abraham of past incarnations, is tasked by a Da Vinci Code-esque Vatican society to trek to Transylvania to kill the Count, not just because Dracula is quite literally the son of Satan, but because, due to a blood oath, or something, A family of vampire hunters cannot go to heaven unless the Transylvanian Prince of Darkness is slain. Kate Beckinsale's Anna, like the rest of the cast, doing a vague Eastern European accent, What We Do in the Shadows style, and her brother Valken, hot, are the last living descendants of the Valerius lineage. Their ancestors are stuck in purgatory, and Valken has just become the new Wolfman, so they'll need all the help they can get. I should also mention that Van Helsing has a crossbow machine gun in this movie. From there I can't quite tell you exactly what happens. My memories of the film are like scattered images from a terrific dream. Van Helsing says something about how he fought the Romans in 72 AD. Frankenstein swings from a rope like Tarzan. Dracula has group sex with his wives inside a block of ice. Demon bats pop like zits with wings. Kate Beckinsale's face appears in the clouds as if she's Simba's long-dead father. What more could you ask? In Van Helsing, you get what you pay for. The movie is loud and proud, free from any of the crushing expectations of today's mega studios. It has none of the self-loathing nonsense of the Zack Snyder DC movies, and is totally uninterested in the sort of sycophantic hero worship for which Marvel has become so well known. Since it's not the first movie to mash together these great universal monsters, and certainly not the last, even if the Dark Universe could never comes to light, Van Helsing wastes no time explaining to you why, or how, these characters all live in the same world. We get it. Dracula and Dr. Frankenstein are friends. We don't need 12 movies to establish this. Cut to the monster slaying. Films like this always leave me wondering, what even is a movie? What must a movie accomplish to be considered good? Does a movie have to contain a moving narrative, great performances, believable characters, or address some deep part of the human experience to achieve goodness? Or can it just be 131 senseless minutes of monsters ripping each other's necks out while a fire played by David Hannum tries to get laid? I love a giant, operatic mess. The Star Wars prequels were the lifeblood of my childhood, which may explain my love of similarly uninhibited disasters like Prometheus, so of course I'm speaking from a place of bias. But there is an uncommon delight that comes from getting hit by a movie like a wrecking ball. I want to live in the timeline where Van Helsing, not Iron Man, kicked off the first full-fledged cinematic universe. I want to see the Transylvania television series that Sommers, allegedly, planned, which would have expanded on the horrors that lived within this dreary Romanian village. I want more steampunk Frankenstein, more hunky Wolfman, a crossover with the Brendan Fraser mummy movies, the creature from the Black Lagoon storyline we never got, and above all, more of Hugh Jackman's big, stupid, leathery cowboy hat. Number 4. Van Helsing is a 2004 American dark fantasy action-adventure film written and directed by Stephen Sommers. It stars Hugh Jackman as vigilante monster hunter Van Helsing, and Kate Beckinsale as Anna Valerius. The film is an homage and tribute to the Universal horror monster films from the 1930s and 1940s, also produced by Universal Studios, which were in turn based on novels by Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley, of which Sommers is a fan. The eponymous character was inspired by the Dutch vampire hunter Abraham Van Helsing from Irish author Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. Distributed by Universal Pictures, the film includes a number of monsters such as Count Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and werewolves in a way similar to the multi-monster movies that Universal produced in the 1940s, such as Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman and House of Dracula. Despite mostly negative reviews, the film grossed over $300 million worldwide. In 1887 Transylvania, Dr. Victor Frankenstein creates a monster with the aid of Count Dracula, who reveals that he plans to use the creature for his own evil plans. Dracula kills the doctor as a mob of villagers storms the castle. His assistant Igor escapes, but the villagers chase the monster to an old windmill and set it ablaze. The villagers are scared off by Dracula and his brides, who witness the monster and the doctor's research apparently destroyed by the fire. 1 year later, after killing the elusive Mr. Hyde at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, monster hunter Van Helsing returns to the Vatican in Rome. He learns that his mission to destroy Dracula and his amnesia are penance for unremembered sins that cause nightmares. He is tasked with helping the last of an ancient Romanian bloodline, Valken Valerius, and his sister Anna, who must kill Dracula before their ancestors may enter heaven. Carl, a friar, provides Van Helsing with aid and weapons. In Transylvania, Velkin is apparently killed during an attempt to trap and kill the Wolfman, and Anna is attacked by Dracula's brides shortly after Van Helsing's arrival. He saves her life and kills Marischka, one of the brides, but as the last of her line, Anna becomes more determined to kill Dracula. In order to protect her, Van Helsing knocks her out to prevent her from leaving. She awakens that night and encounters Velkin, who reveals Dracula has a dark secret, but to her horror, he becomes the Wolfman after having been bitten by the original one earlier and attacks. After she and Van Helsing track him to Frankenstein's castle, they discover that the vampires are attempting to give life to their born dead children, using Velkin as the source of the power. Van Helsing, dubbed Gabriel by Dracula, realizes they had ties in the past. Van Helsing refuses Dracula's offer to return his memory and escapes. The experiment fails, and the vampire children die, but Velkin turns on Anna as he is consumed by his curse. Van Helsing and Anna escape together. Under the remains of the old windmill, Van Helsing and Anna encounter Frankenstein's monster. Because he is not evil, Van Helsing cannot allow him to be killed, even though he claims to be key to Dracula's experiment. The Wolfman witnesses the conversation and escapes to inform Dracula. Meanwhile, Carl discovers a painting that comes to life, depicting a werewolf and a vampire battling. The group travels by carriage to Budapest, luring the remaining brides into a trap and killing Verona. The Wolfman ambushes the real carriage and bites Van Helsing before being killed. Anna is captured and held as a bargaining chip in exchange for Frankenstein. They hide him in a crypt, but he is taken by the Count's undead underlings while Van Helsing and Carl rescue Anna. Returning to the Valerius castle, Carl discovers an inscription and creates a doorway to the castle. After failing to free Frankenstein from his imprisonment, he lets them know of a cure to lycanthropy that Dracula possesses. Carl determines that the bite of the Wolfman is the only way to kill Dracula. He and Anna take Igor to find the cure while Van Helsing goes to free Frankenstein. Igor escapes while the final bride, a Lyra, assaults Anna as Carl tries delivering the cure to Van Helsing. Igor confronts Carl on a bridge, but the confrontation sends Igor falling to his demise. Frankenstein saves Anna and urges her to help Carl and Van Helsing. She kills a Lyra and arrives at the castle. As the Wolfman, Van Helsing and Dracula battle. Dracula tries reasoning with the Wolfman, but Van Helsing bites Dracula, who dissolves into a skeleton. Anna bursts in, causing her to be attacked and accidentally killed by Van Helsing, but not before she delivers the cure. Van Helsing returns to normal, stricken with grief over what he has done. At a funeral pyre, Van Helsing witnesses the spirits of Anna and her family ascending into the clouds while Frankenstein's rows away on a raft out to sea. Van Helsing and Carl ride off into the sunset. Hugh Jackman as Gabriel Van Helsing, a legendary hunter of monsters. Kate Beckinsale as Anna Valerius, together with her brother, are the last descendants of an ancient Romanian family. Richard Roxburgh as Count Vladislaus Dracula, the ruler of Transylvania and lord of the vampires. David Wenham as Carl, a friar of the Holy Order. Schiller Hensley as Frankenstein's monster. Elena Anaya as Lyra, Dracula's youngest and most sadistic concubine. Will Kemp as Velkin Valerius, Anna's brother, who is turned into a werewolf. Kevin J. O'Connor as Igor, a former servant of Frankenstein's, now working for Dracula. Alan Armstrong as Cardinal Jeanette, Van Helsing's superior in the Holy Order. Sylvia Caloca as Verona, Dracula's consort and the leader of the brides. Josie Maran as Marischka, Dracula's concubine. Tom Fisher as Top Hat, a Transylvanian gravedigger. Samuel West as Dr. Victor Frankenstein. Stephen H. Fisher as Dr. Jekyll. Robbie Coltrane as the voice of Mr. Hyde. Van Helsing appears in a board game 1, designed by Fr. Copyright Derek Morriswin, the creator of numerous successful board games such as Saboteur. 2. The board game was released by Mayfair Games in 2010. Vivendi Universal Games published the Van Helsing video game for PlayStation 2, Xbox, PC and Game Boy Advance. The game follows a similar plot to the movie, has gameplay similar to Devil May Cry, and the PS2 and Xbox versions feature the voice talent of many of the actors including Hugh Jackman. Van Helsing also features in a slot game produced by International Game Technology. The game is available in real-world casinos and online, though users in Argentina, Australia, Canada, China, France, Germany, Israel, Italy, Netherlands, Nigeria, Norway, Russia, South Africa, Thailand, Turkey and the US are excluded from playing the online games. 3. The film opened at number 1 in the weekend of May 7-9, 2004. The film grossed $300,257,475 worldwide, of which $120,177,084 was from the US. 4. Van Helsing received mostly negative reviews by critics. 5. Rotten Tomatoes, a review aggregator, reports that 23% of 213 surveyed critics gave the film a positive review. The average rating was 4.2. The site's consensus reads, a hollow creature feature that suffers from CGI overload. 6. Metacritic rated it 35/100 based on 38 reviews. 7. Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times gave the film 3 stars out of 4, stating that at the outset, we may fear Sommers is simply going for X overkill, but by the end, he has somehow succeeded in assembling all his monsters and plot threads into a high-voltage climax. Van Helsing is silly, spectacular and fun. 8. Sommers expanded the story of Van Helsing in 2 direct spin-offs. The animated prequel titled Van Helsing, The London Assignment, takes place before the main events of the film, focusing on Van Helsing's mission to try to stop Jack the Ripper from terrorizing London. There is also a one-shot comic book, published by Dark Horse Comics, titled Van Helsing, From Beneath the Rue Morgue, that follows Van Helsing on a self-contained adventure that occurs during the events of the film, just after the death of Jekyll Hyde in Paris but before Van Helsing returned to Rome. In the adventure, Van Helsing deals with Dr. Moreau and his hybrid mutants. In May 2012, Universal Pictures announced that they are rebooting the film with Alex Kurtzman and Roberto Orci as a 2-year deal to produce a modern reimagining and Tom Cruise to star as the title character and also produce the film. 9. Rupert Sanders is in talks to direct the film. 10. Orci spoken to IGN that he has hinted that both The Mummy and Van Helsing reboots will have a shared universe. 11-12. On November 11, 2015, Variety reports that Jon Spaihts and Eric Serra will write the reboot, but Cruise left the film. However, in 2016, Cruise signed back on to star in Kurtzman's number 5. Hungary's Neocore Games isn't a particularly new face in role-playing games, although its creations since 2009, King Arthur and the King's Crusade, have veered more towards a combination with the real-time and grand strategy genre. The Incredible Adventures of Van Helsing marks a large step towards action-oriented RPGs such as Diablo and Torchlight, and it looks as though the company has a potential winner on its hands if it can continue this highly promising start. Despite likely comparisons to the aforementioned games, Van Helsing still stands out thanks to a stronger emphasis on its writing and humor. Players start off by creating their personal offspring of the now retired, legendary vampire hunter Abraham Van Helsing with some minor customization options, primarily his name and color scheme. Following in his father's footsteps as a monster hunter, the younger Van Helsing has been tasked by the resistance of Borgova, the Gothic capital of the fictional Eastern European country of Borgovia, to eradicate the menace that has taken over. Lending assistance to Van Helsing both in and out of battle is his partner, the ghostly Lady Katarina, who has lent her assistance to the Van Helsings since Abraham rescued her during a previous trip to Borgova. The humorous and snarky writing is a definite strength and helps give the Incredible Adventures of Van Helsing a lot of character. The snarky interactions of Van Helsing and Lady Katarina are a delight, and most of this supporting cast is more than happy to add further entertaining life to the setting. The humor isn't just limited to Borgova's inhabitants. with a number of pleasing references to Monty Python and Lord of the Rings amongst others. Core Games has previously stated this is intended to be the first part in a trilogy, which may go some way to explaining a fairly limp ending that obviously hints that Van Helsing's adventures are far from over, but in general the game does an admirable job of creating an enjoyable setting and extremely likable characters whose return in future games should be eagerly anticipated. Van Helsing frequently finds himself cutting or blasting his way through vast swathes of enemies as he journeys through Borgova and the surrounding areas. Players can switch freely between gun or sword, although it is likely more advantageous to focus on one of these with respect to skills and attributes. Lady Katarina can also physically manifest herself and participate in battle, in a similar manner to Pet's seen in certain other action RPGs, also with the ability to use either gun or sword depending on the player's choice. With her own slightly smaller set of equipment and skills, she also has the ability to remain in her ghostly form, which gives Van Helsing benefits but prevents her from assisting directly with enemy destruction. Van Helsing can have 2 attacks set for each weapon, each corresponding to a mouse button, with an option unlocked part of the way through that allows another 2 to be set as backups and swapped in with a single keyboard press. Players can also make use of Van Helsing's rage meter, which builds as he kills enemies, to add a power-up to their next attack. The skill system is one area where there is some room for improvement. The UI and controls aren't as clear as they could be when it comes to using the power-ups and getting to grips with the system, and there isn't much reason to use more than the standard attack and one area attack throughout the entire game on the normal difficulty. Overall, however, the battle system is generally very solid and enjoyable. There's decent variation in the types of enemies, and dealing destruction to groups of them is a very satisfying experience. As to be expected from this type of action RPG, loot is liberally dropped, and players will find it quickly filling their bags. Fortunately, Katarina can be sent off to sell unwanted items or purchase potions, while Van Helsing can also teleport through the ink, a supernatural alternate dimension, back to his lair and return to where he left off once supplies have been restocked and loot sold. Exploration is another mostly enjoyable part of the game. Each area usually has multiple routes through with lots of nooks and crannies to check out, and it's very easy to get sucked onto searching these in case something neat is hidden within. Van Helsing's secret lair also provides a nice occasional break from the exploration, which can admittedly get a bit tiresome in some of the game's larger areas. Here players can create and place traps for when the lair comes under assault from waves of Van Helsing's enemies, with good placement being key for helping Van Helsing make sure that the enemies don't manage to sneak by and attack his allies holed up inside. The game offers 4 difficulty levels at character creation, along with an optional hardcore mode that operates the usual permadeath feature. For the most part the game strikes a good balance on normal difficulty, providing some areas of challenge but still allowing giblets to fly at a decent rate. The main issue with difficulty comes from the fact that the developers seemingly use just one tactic for increasing difficulty: A numbers, which is most obviously used for the game's final boss, who becomes almost trivial after the ridiculous number of minions are dealt with. Fortunately, the normal game somewhat counteracts the annoyance of being suddenly swamped with a generous revive mechanism that allows players to revive where they died for a small percentage of their gold, or back at the lair for free. Some of the more scripted bosses that require players to use the environment or think a bit more tactically are quite interesting, and it would be preferable to have more of these over the areas where the developers have simply placed more enemies than usual. The game can be completed in less than 15 hours, during which players will likely have vanquished around 10,000 foes, but there are a number of side quests and post-game scenarios to help satisfy players' desires to explore Borgova and spray monster parts all over. The most replayability likely comes from starting again at a higher difficulty. Multiplayer is implemented, although this first time around it feels to be more of an afterthought. Up to 4 Van Helsings can meet in a multiplayer room to adventure together, while players can also select the Go Online option from the menu at any point, which seems to result in the sudden appearance of a random fellow Van Helsing nearby, who more often than not disappears equally as quickly without much interaction. The lack of multiplayer focus doesn't really take anything away from the game, and it can be assumed that this aspect will be improved in future games, but those hoping to find a particularly substantial multiplayer offering may struggle to find it here. Overall, Borgova looks great. The locations are all distinct and the gothic noir flair that permeates the surroundings adds to the setting. Characters are also pretty distinct and nicely attuned to the setting, although players may be a bit disappointed at the relative unflashiness of most of the game's skills and the general lack of variety in Van Helsing's potential wardrobe, at least outside of the nice hats. The way enemies often explode, especially when in large groups, is very satisfying, although those likely to play in more social situations or places may prefer to use the game's option to turn off the effects for blood and scattering of unidentifiable body parts. The music is a very enjoyable listen, with distinct and fitting themes for each of the game's locations, and the voice acting is another area of strength, helping the humor with a high-quality mixture of deadpan, snarky, and hammy deliveries where appropriate. Van Helsing and Katarina's voicing in particular helps to convey some great chemistry between them. With Van Helsing's first set of adventures, Neo-Core Games seems to have hit its stride very quickly. These first steps are a strong start for a series of much promise, and RP gamers should find plenty of reasons to desire to return to Borgova in the near future and create yet more monster giblets. Number 6. Few iterations of Van Helsing have shown him as the soul slayer of vampires or a real hero that can stake his claim as a leading man. Francis Ford Coppola's rendition of Dracula probably manages it best, but even then he is used as a supporting tool to a wider story. That is the beauty of an Anthony Hopkins performance in that period though, where Tom Waits can outshine you but not out-act you. Either way, there aren't too many examples of this important Bram Stoker character being adapted, much less in an independent, standalone format. Van Helsing gave that a go and got the preliminary issues correct. Casting choices were made, the budget was set and the setting was grand. What went wrong for this 2004 adaptation of the classic gothic horror character is what they did with him. Van Helsing is not a good film. Countless rewatches are no longer going to change the mind on that one because at the very core of this feature is something rotten. Hugh Jackman's reserved performance does little to weather the storm. In fact, it's a poor performance because of what surrounds him. This uncoordinated feel never lets up, primarily because there are so many characters used as plot fodder. Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, werewolves and the Vatican. It feels like an unnecessary effort to pair absolutely every bit of the Universal Monsters series under the banner of a character who featured as a supporting player almost everywhere else. It makes little logistical sense in the grander scheme, but also not at all for the Jackman-led feature. Slotting Helsing into that pursuit of Dracula, Richard Roxburgh, is at least tempered well. Director Stephen Sommers manages to overcome the hurdle of basic storytelling and makes the gothic intentions and grander styles very clear. He articulates the final third surprisingly well, with an aesthetic suitable for the Van Helsing character design and everything he faced in the two-thirds of utter drivel that preceded this blowout at the end. Roxburgh and Kate Beckinsale are both wasted and uncomfortable in their roles, which sees them both pale in comparison to the work they would do on either side of this movie. At least Talan Armstrong gives his big screen outing a good go, albeit in such a small role that he may as well have been played by just about anybody. Jackman putting on a different voice, it'd have made no difference to the quality of Van Helsing. Naturally disappointing, but what else can be expected of a film written by the man behind The Scorpion King? There was a time when Sommers was, surprisingly, a valued asset for the action-horror blend that boomed at the turn of the 21st century. He was responsible for the fondly remembered trilogy of the Mummy films as well as an action-packed revival of the long-dormant G.I. Joe franchise some years later. But Van Helsing is a misfire. It is an attempt at replicating the success of the Mummy without having quite as much charm or focus to it. There may be vampires around in the world of Van Helsing, but the only sucker here is the person sitting watching this dire and complicated gothic horror mess. Number 7. The Incredible Adventures of Van Helsing is a Diablo clone, originally released as a 3-part series on PC. While it remains visually gorgeous, Its amalgamation and transition to the Xbox console has created some clunky mechanics and frustratingly difficult scenarios. You play as Van Helsing, the son of the Abraham Van Helsing from Bram Stoker's Dracula, who, along with his companion Katerina, is responding to a letter that calls his father to the mysterious land of Borgovia, or Borgova, or Borgovaria. Honestly, the pronunciation of the place varies so much that I may as well call it Atlantis. Semantics aside, the inevitable happens and you can't travel to Borgovia whatever the normal way. In taking the detour, the inevitable happens again and you take another detour, and after taking the most roundabout, enemy-ridden route and fighting a few ridiculously enjoyable boss battles, you find yourself at a palace of machines, standing over the corpse of a mad scientist. Then the game abruptly ends and you realize that aside from traveling to the city of disputed pronunciation, you have no idea what you are doing or why you are doing it. In short, the story isn't the strong point of the incredible adventures of Van Helsing. At best, it's a gigantic long way round, and at worst a poorly thought-out excuse to warrant the production of the game. Now, I've played and enjoyed many games with less than stellar stories, and the reason these games were enjoyable was because they acknowledged that narrative wasn't their forte, placed gameplay in the foreground and spent as little time as possible shoving their story down your throat. I loved Skate 3, but I couldn't tell you the reason why I was skating, nor could I tell you why exactly I was exploring Pandora and Borderlands. But the exploration was still fun. Honestly, had the game taken a leaf from these proverbial books, it would have excelled, but instead the incredible adventures of Van Helsing spends its time forcing us into cringe-worthy conversations with two-dimensional characters about the story that we don't understand, let alone care about. From here out I'll refer to Neocore's action role-playing outing simply as Van Helsing. The main reason I do this is because, like most of the game's dialogue, the title is unnecessarily wordy yet, at the same time, fairly juvenile. The intro cinematic sets this precedent, introducing the characters and plot in the longest and simplest way possible. The premise of this cinematic is sound, but, like that game's story, poor characterization and poorer writing hold it back. If only the story and dialogue had been handled with the same subtlety as the game's lore, established only through mentions of past times and occurrences. The lore of Van Helsing is minimalistic yet intriguing. Pop culture references to vampire films and even Lord of the Rings are a welcome comedic relief, and in commending Neocore, I can't forget the genuine chemistry between Helsing and Katerina. The voice acting, at least for these two characters, is commendable. Their banter is amusing and, when coupled their talk of previous adventures, adds a depth to the relationship that is lacking in the majority of gameplay. All in all, in terms of narrative and dialogue, Van Helsing leaves a lot to be desired. Lazy storytelling aside, the game is actually fairly intriguing. But as all interesting and ugly people will know, it's difficult to engage an audience after giving a repelling first impression. Luckily for Neocore, the incredible adventures of Van Helsing is far from ugly. The game does suffer from its shaky introduction, but the level and character are too brilliant not to draw that audience in. Both are beautifully and equally diverse. Even during my first playthrough, I could easily differentiate between environments. Borgovia whatnot steampunk aesthetic is starkly different to the Thunderhead Mountains forests, and even the Ink worlds are interesting and psychedelic, though their inclusion in the game is an unexplained annoyance at best. As the game progresses, there are appearances of reskinned and steroided-up versions of previously fought enemies. The Pale Gentleman and the Vivix come to mind here, but the changes in environment and skins are enough to hold your interest, and that, in itself, is an immense compliment to the game's design. Also, the boss battles are phenomenal. Even if I had no idea why I was fighting them, the battles with the Drill Worm and Professor Fulmagati were addictively enjoyable. The game would have benefited significantly from increasing the frequency of these types of battles. The take 5 steps and get swarmed by enemies style of gameplay gets dull quite quickly. Even so, the team at Neocore have structured the gameplay perfectly. Every time I felt myself losing interest, I'd face a boss and my enjoyment would be renewed. Van Helsing's skill system is also well done. Thoughtful upgrading of your character is necessary to progress in the story, and the vast majority of skills are surprisingly useful, at least in their upgraded forms. On the downside, the effects of skills, tricks and auras are, for the most part, only understandable through trial and error. And the game would have done well to properly introduce the idea of power-ups and combos and to explain how they differ from the manual activation of rage. In fact, apart from the obligatory explaining that X does this and Y does that, Van Helsing hardly teaches players anything. It specifically doesn't mention that it's very easy to accidentally change what X and Y do. Now, I'm not, nor will I pretend to be, a veteran in the realm of top-down adventure RPGs, so perhaps I'm lacking in the knowledge that NeoCore assumes its audience to have. But even if I am, Van Helsing's lack of proper tutorials still seems negligent. It isn't a clever or minimalistic way of increasing difficulty, it's lazy and frustrating. And more than this, it makes the game feel like it's throwing you in the pool and yelling backstroke from the sideline, knowing full well that you haven't the faintest idea how to swim, let alone how to differentiate between strokes. Due partly to this lack of explanation, Van Helsing's difficulty is ferocious, not in the Dark Souls sense of clever yet rewarding difficulty, where death means rethinking your approach and victory brings with it a sense of accomplishment. What we have in Van Helsing is a type of difficulty where death means this is impossible and victory means thank God that's over. At the start of the game I was swarmed by enemies that I had no idea how to deal with, so I died. And by the time I deciphered the secrets of rage combos and tactical upgrading, I'd be swarmed by 3 million ranged enemies, each with 3 million hit points, who'd attack simultaneously and kill me in one fell conjoined swoop. And these issues are made worse by certain mechanics. For one, you can't move and attack. If this is meant to make battles more strategic, it isn't. Instead, it usually results in you being enveloped by enemies. This would, I assume, give rise to the shoot and run strategy on PC. However, on Xbox, the PC's point-and-click method of aiming is replaced with a broken bar nothing. You literally can't aim your ranged attacks. I mean, you can turn in a direction and shoot, but the game selects your target for you. And given the fact that you're usually being chased by at least 30 enemies, it seldom chooses the same enemy twice. These mechanics don't destroy the game, it's just that once you've adjusted to them, the game is over. Of course, this opens up the possibilities of never-ending story, scenario and multiplayer modes. Never-ending story mode is essentially identical to a New Game Plus mode. It ups all the monsters to level 30 plus and increases chances of epic item drops. The mode is a standard addition to RPGs these days, and in Van Helsing's case it allows you to restart the story with understanding of the game's mechanics and upgraded systems. While the multiplayer mode seems like an obligatory addition, it's one of the game's most enjoyable features. Character models of Van Helsing don't change between accounts, but the top-down perspective and randomly generated loot prevent any confusion between characters. And the goal-based system actually creates an interesting dynamic in PvP matches. Scenario mode is essentially a story-less version of the game, where you are thrust into certain scenarios with a goal or objective. Here, the game shakes most of its flaws. While the enemies are harder than in story mode, the lack of ridiculous dialogue and character interactions are a welcome change. It's just a shame that this mode wasn't included as a main focus of the game, for, without the story, the game isn't its element. On the whole, for a game that in its title boasts of incredible adventures, Van Helsing doesn't quite live up. Don't get me wrong, the good parts are fantastic, but the bad parts are equally horrible and almost as frequent. The story is arduous, yet the art is breathtaking, and while the boss battles are spectacular, they aren't frequent enough to fully redeem the tedious gameplay in between. See, the thing with the incredible adventures of Van Helsing is that it's just not that incredible, and it's generally a problem when products fail to live up to their advertisements. That said, I don't think that a game like this one would benefit from a title as lengthy and honest as the kinda good but not quite incredible adventures of Van Helsing. Number 8. Here you have a selection of 5 in-depth individual features, which consists of Frankenstein's monster Dracula, the werewolves, the woman of Van Helsing, Anna and Dracula's brides, and the legend of Van Helsing. It also reveals the actors discussing their characters in legendary film and as they have appeared in horror films over the decades, including this one. We also get what this extensive feature covers a lot of the making of information, and also provides some intriguing info about the monsters in the film. We also get a selection of film clips which include The Bride of Frankenstein, 1935, A Frankenstein, 1931, A Dracula, 1931, Son of Dracula, 1943, A House of Frankenstein, 1944, A Frankenstein Meets the Wolf Man, 1943, The Wolf Man, 1941, A Werewolf of London, 1935, and A Dracula's Daughter, 1936. We also get to see some rare behind-the-scenes filming of the film A Van Helsing. Contributors include Schiller Hansley, author of Frankenstein's Monster; Stephen Sommers, writer/director; Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough, vampire novelist; Hugh Jackman, Van Helsing; Crash McCrary, creature concept artist; Greg Cannon, makeup effects artist; Joseph Grossberg, associate visual effects producer; Samuel West, Victor Frankenstein; Kate Beckinsale, Anna; Patrick Tatopoulos, creature concept artist; Elizabeth Miller, professor of English; Richard Roxburgh, Dracula; Stephanie Moss, professor of literature of the occult; Kevin J. O'Connor, Igor; Sylvia Caloca, Verona; R.A. Rondel, stunt coordinator; Gabriella Pescassi, Italian costume designer; Ben Snow, visual effects supervisor; Carlos Humont, costume character art director; Bob Duxey, producer/editor; David Van Becker, professor of English at San Jose University; Will Kemp, Valton, Scott Squires, visual effects supervisor; Industrial Light Plus Magic, San Rafael, California; Christian Elsman, visual effects art director; Andrew Corse, co-model supervisor; Elena Anaya, A. Lira; Josie Maron, Mariska; Sam Mercer, executive producer; and David Wenham, Carl. As usual, you can either view each feature separately or play all. Number 9. If you let first impressions be your guide when you watch a new TV show, you might want to learn a little patience if vampire tales are your thing. The new sci-fi entry into vampiric lore, Van Helsing, starts off as a middling copy of The Walking Dead, where you'll have more questions than answers and couldn't care less about many of the people involved in the story. But, after getting just a couple of episodes in, you might start to see a show that's made of stronger stuff prevail. Van Helsing focuses on Vanessa, Kelly Overton, a young woman who's spent 3 years in a coma while the world has gone all to hell because of a vampire apocalypse. Actually, there's also a real apocalypse going on as well, seeing as how a natural disaster has destroyed a large portion of the United States. Because Vanessa's semi-dead state aroused the suspicion of the federal government, while she's been in her coma, a group of Marines has watched over her in an abandoned hospital per their pre-apocalypse orders. But by the time the story starts, only one, Axel, Jonathan Scarf, is left on duty with Vanessa's vampirized dog, Rukia Bernard, being kept in a cage. It's not long before Axel lets in a ragtag group of survivors and Vanessa wakes up to find the world around her turned upside down. The show is being billed as being Dracula-inspired, but it shares more in common with the aforementioned Walking Dead and Buffy the Vampire Slayer than anything else. You've got a group of survivors fighting to stay alive, and some not making it, perilous trips away from their, relatively, safe current home base, threats both familiar and unknown, and, of course, a woman with the power to turn this topsy-turvy world back to something resembling normal. While it's not bad that it feels a lot like those shows, it does make the first episode of Van Helsing seem somewhat unnecessary. Most of the vampires even act more like zombies than they do traditional vampires from the stories we've seen filmed lately, like in Buffy or True Blood. Their faces are always in varying degrees of "oh crap, that might not be a human." For one thing, and whenever they're on the hunt or feeding there's usually a lot of grunting and slurping. Most of them aren't very posh at all. I think Dracula would be ashamed of these blood-sucking brethren. I was able to watch the first 3 episodes of Van Helsing, and found, watching that first episode, that I had way more questions than I wanted to regarding what was going on. So many questions, in fact, that it took away from the general enjoyment of the show, and I wasn't really able to connect with any of the characters, aside from Axel, because of it. The second episode is where things start to gel. It's a flashback episode that answers a lot of questions and also deepens the mythology of the show. By the time I was done with the final episode available for screening purposes, I felt like the series was finally finding its footing. While it can be difficult to have enough patience when watching a new show, it can also be fun watching it develop into something more than what it appeared to be at first. 3 episodes in, you can definitely tell that the show is building towards something. And, while I admit that I still didn't have much interest in most of the other supporting characters by then, I was more fully committed to the story that was building with Vanessa and Axel. He's a perfect protector. Axel is determined to keep her safe, but once he sees what she can do, and she can do a lot, he doesn't coddle her either. Vanessa is, as someone in a coma would, very slowly beginning to come into her own. After waking up to a wacky world, she's reasonably unbelieving at the dangers that await regular people outside the hospital, but she soon comes around and proves to be even more gifted than she realizes. The performances of Overton and Scarf are absolutely a good reason to tune in to Van Helsing. The two of them make each of their characters relatable, despite some superpowers and the insane situations they find themselves in. Both actors are likable, and I can see why each was chosen to lead a series. Overton, for her part, is sure to grow into a great lead as Vanessa comes into her own. Number 10. Van Helsing. Final Cut is a hack-and-slash RPG title which has seen many different versions over a few short years. This game is the final, fully polished product that came from this cycle. Van Helsing. Final Cut and massive content. Since this is the culmination of multiple games, it has a huge number of characters and many different mission types. Here are just a few. Classic Story Mode details the final adventure of Van Helsing's descendant, and Katarina Adventure Mode is similar to the Bounty Mode in Diablo 3, where you fight enemies in the order you choose. For additional loot, Tower Defense missions are where you use towers and abilities to defend an area. Resistance missions are a marked departure from the normal game where you send teams out on dangerous assignments. As you can see, the game really does have an incredible amount of content. Deep skill trees for players and companions. Each skill has power-ups and combo attacks across a massive tree. At the same time, your companion has an equally deep set of bonuses. On top of this, you have your normal attribute points, so each character is incredibly flexible. With games like this, control is always important. We tested it with both a controller and keyboard. Both worked extremely well with the game. Extensive character customization in Van Helsing. Final Cut. While your appearance mostly stays the same, your in-game capabilities change drastically. Even your ghost companion Katarina has a huge skill tree with branching paths. Item crafting is also really excellent in this game. In fact, it has the most flexible system we've seen in a game. If you find a favorite item, you can continue adding slots to it constantly by using essences. Monster vs. Monster appeal. What sets this apart from many other games in the genre is that the characters are not in some vacuum of hate. Enemies actually hate and attack each other. This allows you to use certain mobs strategically to eliminate others. Perhaps the biggest selling point for the game is the sheer amount of content contained within. Spelling errors are also a big part of this game. We wouldn't say anything, but some of them are just egregious. In fact, the entire game feels rather unpolished in many sections. It feels more like a Torchlight or Diablo mod than a full game at times. It just seems like the developers didn't care. While polishing the gameplay, they also worked on their 2D art for Van Helsing. Final cut. While that section was never bad, it's at an especially beautiful level right now. As with any hack and slash, cooperative play is extremely important. Many abilities have excellent synergy and it's easy to get a game together. Everything about this sector is competently done. Final verdict 4/5. A great A. Huge amounts of content pair up well with smooth gameplay to create a great hack and slash title. Even the story mode is fairly interesting throughout. Wrapping up the Van Helsing tale. Unfortunately, some very simple spelling mistakes keep the game from being absolutely polished. We certainly enjoyed the game and it is definitely worth picking up during the autumn sale for $22.49. Number 11. In the 2004 film Van Helsing, we first meet the eponymous monster hunter, Hugh Jackman, in Paris, in hot pursuit of the monstrous murderer Mr. Hyde. Van Helsing has orders from his superiors to attempt to capture Hyde in order to extricate his better half, Dr. Henry Jekyll, but Hyde doesn't care for the idea. A fracas ensues in and around Notre Dame Cathedral, which ultimately results in Hyde falling to his death as he reverts back to Jekyll. Much like in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Hyde is a monstrous creature like the Incredible Hulk, rather than the smaller Mr. Hyde of Robert Louis Stevenson's classic novella The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Astute Van Helsing viewers might have found something familiar about Hyde, who is played by actor Robbie Coltrane. Coltrane is a Scottish actor, writer, and comedian renowned for many critically acclaimed performances on stage and screen. Not sure where you've seen him before? Here are a few of his most prominent roles. Robbie Coltrane's acting beginnings. Robbie Coltrane's first major credited role was on the 1987 TV miniseries Tutti Frutti, a cult hit from BBC Scotland. Coltrane played Danny McGlone, aka Big Jazza, a member of a rock and roll band called the Majestics. The series chronicled their reunion tour after the death of their lead singer. From there, Coltrane would appear in Rowan Atkinson's historical comedy Blackadder III as Dr. Samuel Johnson and played the spirit of Christmas in Blackadder's Christmas Carol in 1988. He would also portray Shakespeare's famous reprobate Sir John Falstaff in Kenneth Branagh's 1989 adaptation of Henry V. But it would be 1990's Nuns on the Run that would boost Coltrane's profile in North America. In this film, Coltrane portrays gangster Charlie McManus, who, along with his partner Brian Hope, Erica Idle, rob their gangster boss when they determine he's making plans to have them killed off. Thanks to Brian, the getaway car doesn't have enough gas, and the pair find themselves forced to go undercover at a nunnery in order to lie low until the heat dies down. While receiving mixed reviews, the film was a commercial hit in its limited U.S. release and paved the way for later opportunities, such as playing criminal psychiatrist Dr. Eddie Fitzgerald on the British TV crime drama Cracker. Robbie Coltrane played Valentin Zukovsky in 2 James Bond films in 1995. Robbie Coltrane portrayed Valentin Zukovsky in GoldenEye, Pierce Brosnan's debut film as 007. Zukovsky is a former KGB operative turned Russian gangster with a penchant for a luxurious lifestyle. By the time James Bond meets up with him in the film, Zukovsky has left the KGB behind for a place in the Russian mafia. Bond needs information about the mysterious Janus from Zukovsky, but the exchange is complicated by the fact that Bond left him with a limp after shooting him in the knee on top of stealing both his car and his woman. Needless to say, Bond isn't Zukovsky's favorite person. He appears once more in 1999's The World Is Not Enough, where he holds court in a luxurious casino in Baku. He's shot during an attempt to rescue Bond, their enmity having smoothed into something akin to friendship. Robbie Coltrane is Hagrid from Harry Potter in 2001. Robbie Coltrane made his debut as Hogwarts' most famous gamekeeper Rubeus Hagrid in the film adaptation of J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Coltrane would go on to portray the Gentle Giant for the course of the Harry Potter films all the way through to the 2-part finale Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, giving life to the simple but kind-hearted man who acted as protector and mentor to Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ron Weasley during their adventures at Hogwarts. The Hogwarts Keeper of Keys, Gamekeeper, Groundskeeper, and eventual Professor of Magical Creatures would be a staunch ally to the heroes of the Order of the Phoenix.